everybody, back again. So we are on chapter 29 called The Other Children Go Home. And this is the second to last chapter. So there are two more chapters left in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. We must go down and take a look at our little friends before we do anything else, Mr. Wonka. He pressed a different button and the elevator dropped lower. And soon it was hovering just above the entrance gates to the factory. Looking down now, Charlie could see the children and their parents standing in a little group just inside the gates. I can only see three, he said. Who's missing? I expect it's Mike TV, Mr. Wonka said, but he'll be coming along soon. Do you see the trucks? Mr. Wonka pointed to a long line of gigantic covered vans parked in a line nearby. Yes, said Charlie. What are they for? Don't you remember that it said on the golden tickets? Every child goes home with a lifetime supply of candy. There's one truckload for each of them, loaded to the brim. Aha, Mr. Wonka went on. There goes our friend Augustus Gloop. Do you see him? He's getting into the first truck with his mother and father. You mean he's really all right? Asked Charlie, astonished. Even after going up in that awful pipe? He's very much all right, said Mr. Wonka. He's changed, said Grandpa Joe, peering down through the glass elevator. He used to be fat. Now he's thin as a straw. Of course he's changed, said Mr. Wonka, laughing. He got squeezed up the pipe. Don't you remember? And look, there goes Miss Violet Beauregard, the great gum chewer. It seems as though they've managed to de-juice her after all. I'm so glad. And how healthy she looks. Much better than before. But she's purple in the face, cried Grandpa Joe. So she is, said Mr. Wonka. Ah, well, there's nothing we can do about that. Good gracious, cried Charlie. Look at poor Veruca Salt and Mr. and Mrs. Salt. They're simply covered with garbage. And here comes Mike TV, said Grandpa Joe. Good heavens, what have they done to him? He's about 10 feet tall and thin as a wire. They've overstretched him on the gum stretching machine, said Mr. Wonka. How very careless. But now how dreadful for him, said Charlie. Nonsense, said Mr. Wonka. He's very lucky. Every basketball team in the country will be trying to get him. But now, he added, it's time that we left these four silly children. I have something very important to talk to you about, my dear Charlie. Mr. Wonka pressed another button, and the elevator swung upwards into the sky. So here's the picture. It's got the factory, and you can see Willy Wonka and Charlie and Grandpa Joe in the elevator, and the kids down at the bottom, and all the trucks curved around the fence of the factory for them to all go home. I see Mike TV. You see him? He's like super tall and skinny right there. And everybody else is a bit shorter than he. Chapter 30 is called Charlie's Chocolate Factory. Not Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, but Charlie's Chocolate Factory. The great glass elevator was now hovering high over town. Inside the elevator stood Mr. Wonka, Grandpa Joe, and little Charlie. How I love my chocolate factory, said Mr. Wonka, gazing down. Then he paused and he turned around and looked at Charlie with the most serious expression on his face. Do you love it too, Charlie? He asked. Oh, yes, cried Charlie. I think it's the most wonderful place in the whole world. Very pleased to hear you say that, said Mr. Wonka, looking more serious than ever. He went on staring at Charlie. Yes, he said, I'm very pleased indeed to hear that you say that. And now I shall tell you why. Mr. Wonka cocked his head to the one side, and all at once the tiny twinkling wrinkles of a smile appeared around the corners of his eyes, and he said, You see, my dear boy, I've decided to make you a present of the whole place. As soon as you're old enough to run it, the entire factory will become yours. Charlie stared at Mr. Wonka. Grandpa Joe opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It's quite true, Mr. Wonka said, smiling broadly now. I'm really giving it to you. That's all right, isn't it? Giving it to him? Gasped Grandpa Joe. You must be joking. I'm not joking, sir. I'm deadly serious. But, why should you want to give your factory to little Charlie? Listen, Mr. Wonka said. I'm an old man. I'm much older than you think. I can't go on forever. I've got no children of my own, no family at all. So who's going to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself? Someone's got to run the factory when I get too old to do it myself, if only for the sake of the Oompa Loompas. Mind you, there are thousands of clever men who would give anything for the chance to come in and take over for me, but I don't want that sort of person. I don't want a grown up person at all. A grown up won't listen to me. He won't learn. He will try to do things his own way and not mine. So I have to have a child. I want a good, sensible, loving child, one whom I can tell all my most precious candy making secrets while I'm still alive. So that is why you sent out the golden tickets, cried Charlie. Exactly, said Mr. Wonka. I decided to invite 5 children to the factory, and the one I liked best at the end of the day would be the winner. But Mr. Wonka, stammered Grandpa Joe, do you really and truly mean that you're giving the whole of this factory to Charlie? After all, there's no time for arguments, cried Mr. Wonka. We must go at once and fetch the rest of the family, Charlie's father and mother, and anyone else that's around. They can all live in the factory from now on. They can all help to run it until Charlie's old enough to do it by himself. Where do you live, Charlie? Charlie peered down through the glass elevator at the snow-covered houses that lay below. It's over there, he said, pointing at the little cottage right on the edge of town, the tiny little one. I see it, cried Mr. Wonka, and he pressed some of the buttons, and the elevator shot down toward Charlie's house. I'm afraid my mother won't come with us, Charlie said sadly. Why ever not? Because she won't leave Grandma Josephine and Grandpa Georgina and Grandpa George. But they must come too. They can't, Charlie said. They're very old, and they haven't been out of bed in 20 years. Then we'll take the bed all along as well. With them in it, said Mr. Wonka. There's plenty of room in this elevator for a bed. You won't get the bed out of the house, said Grandpa Joe. It won't go through the door. You mustn't despair, cried Mr. Wonka. Nothing's impossible. You watch. The elevator was now hovering over the roof of the Bucket's little house. What are you going to do? Cried Charlie. I'm going right on in to fetch them, said Mr. Wonka. How? Asked Grandpa Joe. Through the roof, said Mr. Wonka, pressing another button. No, shouted Charlie. Stop, shouted Grandpa Joe. Crash! The elevator went right down through the roof of the house, into the old people's bedroom. Showers of dust and broken tiles and bits of wood and cockroaches and spiders and bricks and cement went raining down on the 3 old ones who were lying in bed. Each of them thought that the end of the world had come. Here's a picture of them crashing through the roof. Everyone looks quite surprised. Grandma Georgina fainted. Grandpa George Josephine dropped her false teeth. Grandpa George put his head under a blanket, and Mr. and Mrs. Bucket came rushing in from the next room. Save us! Cried Grandma Josephine. Calm yourself, my darling wife, said Grandpa Joe, stepping out of the elevator. It's only us. Mother! Cried Charlie, rushing into Mr. and Mrs. Bucket's arms. Mother, listen to what's happened. We're all going back to live in Mr. Wonka's factory, and we're going to help him run it, and he's given it all to me. And... What are you talking about? Said Mrs. Bucket. Just look at our house, cried poor Mr. Bucket. It's in ruins. My dear sir, said Mr. Wonka, jumping forward, shaking Mr. Bucket warmly by the hand. I'm so very glad to meet you. You mustn't worry about your house. From now on, you're never going to need to... Oh, sorry, again, anyway. Who is this crazy man? Screamed Grandma Josephine. He could have killed us all. This, said Grandpa Joe, is Mr. Willy Wonka himself. It took quite a time for Grandpa Joe and Charlie to explain to everyone exactly what had been happening to them all day, and even then they all refused to ride back to the factory in the elevator. I'd rather die in my bed, cried Grandma Josephine. So would I, said Grandma Georgina. I refuse to go, announced Grandpa George. So Mr. Wonka and Grandpa Joe and Charlie, taking no notice of their screams, simply pushed the bed onto the elevator. They pushed Mr. and Mrs. Bucket in after it. Then they got them in themselves, and Mr. Wonka pressed a button. The doors closed. Grandma Georgina screamed, and the elevator rose up off the floor and shot through the hole in the roof out into the open sky. Charlie climbed onto the bed and tried to calm the 3 old people, who were still petrified with fear. Please don't be frightened, he said. It's quite safe, and we're going to the most wonderful place in the world. Charlie's right, said Grandpa Joe. You can see There's Charlie all excited telling his mom, and Willy Wonka in the background, and Mr. Bucket standing there, and it looks like Grandpa Joe is, he just loves to dance around. He is so funny. Will there be anything to eat when we get there? Asked Grandma Josephine. I'm starving. The whole family is starving. Anything to eat? Cried Charlie, laughing. Oh, you just wait and see. And there they go, off into the sky to go to their new factory, which is all theirs. And they won't probably have to eat cabbage soup ever again, which would be wonderful. That's the end of the story by Roald Dahl, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. A great one. He has others too. There was a list inside here. James and the Giant Peach. I don't know if you've seen that movie. That's a great one. Matilda's another movie that he turned into. That one of his books was turned into a movie. I thought I saw a list in this book. Maybe it was in a different book. Let's see. What else is there? Gremlins, which was made in the 80s, was based on a. I guess there isn't a list in here. Maybe it was in the other book. It was based on a short story that Roald Dahl wrote. He's written a lot of stuff for kids and for adults. Just a ton of great. He has just great things. The BFG. We all know the BFG. Love the BFG. Don't forget to watch the movie. It's the best. The new one. Now, there's an old cartoon that's pretty good too, but the new one that came out in the theaters probably about maybe 4 years ago by now. It's good and funny. It's got funnier parts in it than were in the book. So that's the end of that. I have a new Scaredy Squirrel book that I plan on reading to you tomorrow that I just got the other day. Pretty excited about that. And I know that you guys love Scaredy Squirrel, so I will read that to you tomorrow. So I will see you then. Bye.